Mideast peace?
I greatly look forward to discussing this in detail with you, Mr. President.
President Trump hosts Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and encourages a deal. Terror in Pakistan. Catholics honor victims of a suicide bomb in Lahore. Abortion agenda. A fashion magazine publishes a gift guide for teens who had abortions. And a night to shine. A once-in-a-lifetime evening in Peru for people with special needs. On EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, February 15th, 2017. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Donald Trump's pick for Labor Secretary withdraws his nomination. Fast food CEO Andrew Puzder faced pushback from Democrats and even some Republicans. They were concerned over his failure to pay taxes on a former housekeeper who wasn't authorized to work in the U.S. President Donald Trump asks Israel's prime minister to hold off on building more Jewish settlements. It's the first time the president has addressed the issue. It came during Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to the White House. Wyatt Goolsbee was at the press conference and joins us on the North Lawn. Wyatt.
Lauren, one day after Valentine's Day, the president promises lots of love to the Israeli prime minister, but it wasn't all hugs and kisses. After weeks of dancing around the issue of Israeli settlements, President Trump made a bold request to the leader of the strongest democracy in the Middle East.
I'd like to see you hold back on settlements for a little bit. We'll work something out, but I would like to see a deal be made. I think a deal will be made.
Let's try it.
Doesn't sound too optimistic, but that's... He's a good negotiator.
That's the art of the deal.
Despite different approaches to achieving peace in the Middle East, President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu reaffirmed their unbreakable bond. Yet the president held back from supporting a two-state solution, a longtime U.S. policy. He says he wants Israelis and Palestinians to negotiate a deal directly. Netanyahu says there are conditions.
Palestinians must recognize the Jewish state. They have to stop calling for Israel's destruction.
Peace in the region, the overarching goal of today's meeting. The big topics include Iran and the threat it poses, defeating ISIS, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and Trump's support for moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem.
The Israelis are going to have to show some flexibility, which is hard. It's hard to do.
The administration is also talking to Palestinians. CIA Director Mike Pompeo secretly meeting last night with Mahmoud Abbas at his headquarters in the West Bank. With all of the challenges, one area where both Trump and Netanyahu agree, fighting terrorism.
Under your leadership, I believe we can reverse the rising tide of radical Islam. And in this great task, as in so many others, Israel stands with you.
Palestinian officials are worried they will be sidelined by this administration, which is seen as very pro-Israel. Pompeo's trip may help quell that fear, although the White House has not directly addressed their concern. Lauren.
Wyatt, Prime Minister Netanyahu denounced Iran, saying the U.S. and Israel are going to make sure that a known supporter of terrorism doesn't acquire a nuclear weapon. Did they talk about policy? How are they going to do that?
Yes, Lauren. Netanyahu says President Trump has done a good job of contacting regional Arab countries about deterring Iran. Trump seemed surprised, telling the prime minister he wasn't yet ready to reveal that. But the president says it is true, and they are working with a number of other countries on the Iran issue. Lauren.
Thank you. Wyatt Goolsbee at the White House. Catholics have a deep connection to the Jewish people and the region. The church was born in the area that is now Israel and the Palestinian territories. The holy sites, the places where Jesus lived and died, are a destination for millions of pilgrims every year. Pope John Paul II called the Jewish people our older brothers and sisters in the faith. He said Christians cannot understand themselves unless they make reference to their Jewish roots. And Pope Francis visited the Holy Land in 2014. He has shown commitment to the peace process by hosting a prayer service for Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres and Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas in the Vatican later that year. Joining us now is Blaise Mishtal, Director of National Security for the Bipartisan Policy Center. Blaise, welcome to the program.
Good evening. Good to be with you, Lauren.
No U.S. president has been successful in brokering this peace deal. Is this something that Donald Trump should be focusing on? He says he thinks that his son, Jared Kushner, can broker, quote, the toughest deal in the world.
Well, partially because no one has accomplished it. It's such a prize, right? If you can get this, this is the legacy of all legacies. This is the deal of all deals. If you want to be known for the art of the deal, this is what you have to accomplish.
Is this what they should be focusing on with Israel?
Well, but that's the flip side of this. Bill Clinton didn't accomplish this when the Middle East was relatively peaceful. George Bush didn't accomplish this when we just had a war in Iraq. Obama didn't accomplish this when he just had wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and just starting in Syria. The Middle East is much more restive now. There's a lot more issues at stake. Whether this is the right place to focus is unclear.
Is up for debate. Israel can be a key partner, though, in navigating regional issues, I think, that are important to the U.S. What are those regional issues?
I think there's three: Iran, Iran, and Iran. And if you were to ask in the Middle East if there's any upside to President Obama's Middle East policies, they would say the fear of Iran had the side effect of bringing Israel and Sunni Arabs, specifically Saudi Arabia, the Gulf countries, closer together because they both fear the growing power of Iran. And so if there's anything that our allies would like us to focus on in the Middle East, it's Iran, its support for terrorism, and its overthrowing of regimes in places like Yemen, and support for murderous regimes like those of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad.
The other thing that came up was moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and President Trump said that it had to be done with great care. What is going to happen?
Well, presumably he's heard from his Arab allies. He talked to the King of Saudi Arabia and the King of Jordan early on and after inauguration, who told him, you know, we want to support you on what you're doing against ISIS. We want to support you in what you want to do against Iran. It's going to be hard for us to do that. Our populations are going to rise up against us if you're seen as doing this. So maybe this is a place where you should move a little more slowly.
It seems like he has reversed positions on several different things, as from campaign to actual governing. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's one thing to make campaign promises. It's another thing when you think about what are the implications, what will it take to carry out some of these promises that I made. You mentioned you mentioned the embassy. There's also tearing up the Iran deal. There's support for settlements, all of which he's walked back, presumably because he's heard either from our own diplomats or our allies, you know, there's side effects here that we should think through or at least prepare for before we do this. But yet, you know, he still wants to charge ahead. We saw today, he said, maybe we're not going to support the two-state solution, which is a major change from U.S. policy over the last 15 years.
Saying that he wants to do what they want, what will bring peace, again,
Yes.
to the gold ring. Right. Okay, Blaise Mishtal, thank you so much, the Bipartisan Policy Center.
Thank you, Lauren.
President Trump lashes out at intelligence officials and the media for what he calls unfair treatment of ousted National Security Advisor Mike Flynn. And he's blaming illegally leaked information for the reports that he and his campaign had contact with Russia. Lawmakers demand answers about the scandal. Jason Calvi joins us from Capitol Hill. Jason.
Lauren, White House officials say they found nothing illegal when they reviewed transcripts of U.S. intelligence's secretly recorded calls between Michael Flynn and Russia's ambassador to the U.S. But both Democrats and Republicans here at the Capitol are demanding an investigation into what happened.
President Donald Trump defends his former national security advisor, his first public comments on the matter.
I think it's very, very unfair what's happened to General Flynn, the way he was treated, and the documents and papers that were illegally, I stress that, illegally leaked.
General Mike Flynn was forced to resign this week after misleading the vice president about his contacts with Russia's ambassador to the United States. Republican Steve King also shifting the narrative to the leaks.
There are people within the intelligence community that disagree with President Trump, that don't want to see his administration succeed. That's part of the configuration of these timed leaks that came out.
But lawmakers want answers from the president, including the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, Congressman Adam Schiff.
He knew weeks ago that Flynn had lied, when he knew weeks ago that the vice president had misled the country because Flynn had lied. He was okay with that. He was going to do nothing, say nothing about that.
both parties want to see the transcripts of Flynn's calls.
It should be very easy to get this transcript and to get some of the information from the FBI to see what did Flynn discuss, did he do anything wrong, and then obviously how did he communicate that to the White House.
Also, the New York Times reports that U.S. agencies intercepted calls last year between Russian intelligence officials and members of Trump's campaign team.
We know that the Russians attempted to affect the outcome of our election. We know that, although we don't think they succeeded.
In a string of tweets this morning, President Trump says the Russian-Trump connection is nonsense. He says the media is trying to cover up for Hillary Clinton's losing campaign. And Lauren, General Flynn himself tells the Daily Caller that he didn't cross any lines in his conversations with the Russian ambassador.
Besides demanding to see the transcripts of Flynn's phone calls, what else are lawmakers doing?
Well, Democrats in the Senate huddled in an emergency meeting to talk about this week's revelations. They demanded that the new Attorney General and Trump campaign ally Jeff Sessions recuse himself from the investigation. They also want General Flynn to testify here.
Okay, Jason Calvi on Capitol Hill. Thank you, Jason. Star power at the Capitol today. Actor Ashton Kutcher advocates against human trafficking at a Senate hearing, saying he wants to defend the right to pursue happiness.
I believe that it is incumbent upon us as citizens of this nation, as Americans, to bestow that right upon others, upon each other, and upon the rest of the world.
Kutcher is co-founder of Thorn, which builds software to fight human trafficking and sexual exploitation of children. It's an issue close to the Holy Father's heart. Other stories our EWTN News Nightly team is covering in today's world. Malaysian police arrest a woman in the apparent assassination of Kim Jong-nam, the half-brother of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Nam was estranged from his younger brother and had been living abroad for years. His death set off waves of speculation over whether North Korea is linked to the killing. Police arrested one woman carrying Vietnamese travel documents, and they are searching for more suspects. 2 suicide bombings in northwestern Pakistan kill at least 6 people. A breakaway Taliban group claims responsibility for one of the attacks. Hours later, a bomber struck a car filled with local judges. The deadly bombings follow an almost 3-month lull in the volatile region. And Catholics in Pakistan are remembering the victims of another terror attack by the same group. Earlier this week, Italian media say the Lahore Cathedral is holding a vigil to pray for them. A suicide bomber blew himself up in front of Parliament during a protest rally. 15 people died and more than 100 others were hurt. The terrorist group involved also claimed responsibility for an attack on Christians last Easter. The first Christians are starting to return to eastern Mosul in Iraq. At least 3 Armenian families are back home despite insecurity throughout the city. Due to violence and civilian deaths, the United Nations says it's temporarily pausing aid operations. ISIS continues to make it difficult for the group to provide assistance. America and its allies have killed more than 60,000 ISIS militants in Iraq. Military.com says that figure is higher than in December, and the U.S. military says that's a sign of how successful the fight against terrorism has been. The Pentagon said last summer there were 15,000 to 20,000 militants left in Iraq and Syria. Pope Francis insists indigenous people need to give prior consent for any economic activity on their ancestral lands. His remarks come as the Trump administration seeks to advance construction of an oil pipeline, despite opposition from Native Americans.
En este sentido, siempre debe prevalecer el derecho al consentimiento previo e informado.
The Holy Father saying the right to prior and informed consent should always prevail. He says only then is it possible to guarantee peaceful cooperation between governing authorities and indigenous peoples. Alan Holdren is the Rome bureau chief for Catholic News Agency. Alan, what inspired the Pope's comments today?
Well, Lauren, he was speaking in a private audience with about 24 representatives of indigenous cultures, peoples of the world. They're in Rome taking part in UN meetings this week. He said for them a key issue is reconciling economic development and the right to economic development with the protection of their indigenous cultures and lands. So this is something very, very important worldwide for indigenous peoples.
Is it a criticism of President Trump's decision to go ahead with the construction of the Dakota pipeline here?
Well, he wasn't specifically referring to that Dakota pipeline project, Lauren. We reached out to the Vatican press office and they said that there was not a direct reference to that. But Pope Francis hasn't made any secret of his encouragement of indigenous peoples of the world to really look out for their identity and to speak up in protection of their identities and their cultures. It was just 1 year ago today, actually, that the Pope was celebrating a Mass for indigenous peoples in the Chiapas state in Mexico, the poorest state in Mexico, where more than a third of the population is indigenous.
Doesn't seem like it was that long ago. What else is Pope Francis asking governments to do?
He's asking them to involve indigenous peoples in decisions, especially those that regard their lands and their cultures, saying that they should have full participation in those decisions at a government level. He spoke out in particular for women and for children, saying that they really need to be represented in these major decisions that have their interests at stake.
Alan Holdren, Catholic News Agency, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Lauren.
Pope Francis says when we face challenges in life, we must remember God's mercy can overcome anything.
Strapperà dalle sue mani e dalla comunione con lui.
The Holy Father made the remarks at his weekly meeting with pilgrims in the Vatican, continuing his reflections on Christian hope. Pope Francis says life with God does not mean a life free from suffering, but we must find peace amidst suffering. An unscripted moment at the Pope's talk today. A children's choir broke out into song as the Holy Father greeted them. It's not unusual for a choir to sing a line or two, but this choir kept going. Once they did stop, Pope Francis said to them that their tenaciousness or their tenacity is an example for us, adding that that's how we should pray, fervently. Coming up, more states make a push to protect unborn children. And designer babies? Scientists consider altering embryos to fight diseases. A report published by the National Academy of Sciences issues guidelines on human gene editing. Ethicists did not recommend a total ban of the practice of altering embryos. They say it needs to be done, but done safely. Altering human genes could be used to stop babies from inheriting a family disease. The Catholic Church warns that current forms of gene therapy are immoral because it poses a risk to the baby. Lawmakers in Arkansas vote to punish doctors who perform abortions based solely on whether the parents want to have a boy or a girl. Opponents say sex selection ban is unconstitutional. At least 7 states have similar laws, and the Arkansas bill now goes to the state Senate. Lawmakers in Texas proposed 3 new pro-life bills. One would ban dilation and evacuation abortions where the unborn baby is vacuumed out of the womb. Another bill would require aborted babies to be buried or cremated, and a third proposal would ban the donation of fetal tissue. Teen Vogue, a magazine geared toward teenage girls, recently posted an online story titled, "What to Get a Friend Post-Abortion." The article suggests gifts to lift her spirit. It says, the worst part of all, this isn't the procedure itself, which, by the way, is completely safe as long as you have access to a good clinic. The worst part is how you're treated afterwards. Charmaine Yost is an American writer and political commentator. She was formerly the president and CEO of Americans United for Life. You're now with the American Values Group.
I am.
Thanks
for having me, Lauren.
Thank you so much for being here, Charmaine. The article suggests things like watching a silly movie, buying them a girl power cap, downloading a Ruth Bader Ginsburg coloring book, and everyone that I know—
Always my go-to.
Right, when you're feeling sad. Everyone that I know who has just been completely shocked. Number one, that they did something like this, but number two, that it's teens. This is this is something that's geared toward teenagers.
Right, it's really heartbreaking because it's very obviously, yeah, I would say even tweens. You know, it's very geared towards younger teenagers, and that's really deeply troubling, particularly because it's so chirpy and so happy and so
Get your BFF,
right.
you know, a heating pad.
And the whole thing too, for you and I who've been working on this issue for a very long time and know the data on how many things can go wrong with abortions, the long-term consequences for women in terms of depression. In fact, the rate of very serious depression following abortion for teenagers in particular is almost double what it is for older women. And so I'm very troubled by the chirpy message that tells these girls that it's completely safe. I mean, they offer no window of possibility that it could be a problem for them. And this whole idea somehow that the only reason there could be any trouble afterward would be other people's reactions.
Too. What do you think this says about the erosion of values in media?
Well, I think they're really trying to normalize abortion, you know, particularly over the last few years as we've gone through the implementation of Obamacare. The idea that abortion is health care is one of the #1 items of agenda for the abortion industry. So that's partly why we're seeing such pushback, such hatred, so much hostility in the marches and kind of the girl power, women power idea is that they see their progress with defining abortion as something completely normal as being threatened right now.
How can parents and youth leaders counter these types of messages to teenagers?
Well, I think it's one positive aspect of this article is that awareness. It has been heightened for mothers in particular to be aware that it's not okay to just kind of let your daughter be reading Teen Vogue and assume that it's going to be just fashion and makeup advice, that there is a real political agenda going on.
And a bias.
And I think, you know, just being sure that you're having those conversations with your daughter. For me, I have teenage daughters, and, you know, being sure that you're talking to them about it a lot is the key thing.
So do I. I have a tween who just became a teen, and needless to say, Teen Vogue is not going to cross my threshold. Okay, thank you so much, Charmaine Yost, American writer, and she is now with the Senior Fellow with American Values.
Thanks, Lauren,
for joining me. Up next, Night to Shine. A prom for students with special needs in Peru. A Catholic hospital denies it unfairly discriminated against a transgender person. The person sued after the hospital refused to perform a hysterectomy. The St. Joseph Medical Center in Paterson, New Jersey is following guidelines from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. The bishops say the hospital doesn't have to perform medical procedures judged morally wrong by the church. Lawmakers in Arkansas are working on a bathroom bill to protect privacy. The Republican governor worries backlash from transgender advocates could harm the state. And in North Carolina, Governor Roy Cooper, a Democrat, proposes a compromise to repeal the state's bathroom bill. A powerful Republican leader dismissed it, saying any agreements between the governor and the GOP are still far off. In the 2016 presidential election, Libertarian candidate Gary Johnson received about 4 million votes. That's a big increase from the 1.2 million he received in 2012. Joining us now is Stephanie Slade, managing editor of Reason, which is a libertarian magazine. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to talk about abortion and the abortion platform here. You have recently written a piece saying that you reject the party platform on abortion. Let's take a look at it. It says, "We believe that government should be kept out of the matter, leaving the question to each person for their conscientious consideration." Why do you reject the platform?
Well, just as you have sort of the conservative movement and then the GOP, and there isn't always perfect overlap between those two things, it is totally possible to be what I call a small L libertarian, meaning I believe that freedom leads to human flourishing, and I want to have maximum freedom for the maximum number of people in the world around me. But that doesn't mean that I have to necessarily agree with all the ways that the Libertarian Party has chosen to go about trying to get its candidates elected. So when I look at an ultrasound, I see a human person, and so that makes abortion an act of violence for me.
But the the basic tenet of libertarians is that you believe in personal liberty and you feel that the government shouldn't impose restrictions on someone's beliefs. And that's what pro-abortion people think that Roe versus Wade is doing.
Right. Most people would, I think, acknowledge up front that there's a difference between issues where a person is doing something that only affects themselves and issues where there's a victim involved. And so you really have to consider whether abortion is an issue that involves one person, one human being, or two human beings. And I think it involves two.
Let's look at the overall trend. According to a 2012 book, The Libertarian Vote, written by somebody who used to work at Reason, the polling director, 62% of libertarians are pro-choice, 37% are pro-life. So that seems to me to mirror a lot of what the society is happening in the general society. How active, though, is the pro-life movement in the Libertarian Party?
Within the party proper, probably not very active. But within the larger libertarian movement of people who, again, sort of share this worldview that I have that says that freedom is good and we should be maximizing freedom so people can make choices for themselves and sort of pursue the good as they see the good, it's much more common to find people who hold these pro-life views like I do. Again, it's somewhere between 30 and 40%. That's a minority for sure, but it's a significant minority.
Stephanie Slade, managing editor of Reason magazine. Thank you for joining us. A prom to remember for people with special needs. A Night to Shine is a project sponsored by professional athlete Tim Tebow to hold celebrations all over the world for people who don't normally have the opportunity. Our news partners in Peru captured video of this event last week, where 128 children and young adults celebrated the gift of life.
The truth is there's very, very little activity like this. A whole night offered, really, of joy, of faith, of fun, of dancing, really a special night for them. So the families have been very grateful.
This year, the Tim Tebow Foundation sponsored 375 proms all over the U.S. and 11 countries in coordination with parishes and Christian communities. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, I'm Lauren Ashburn. Don't forget, you can see every broadcast of the show on EWTN's YouTube channel. We will leave you tonight with a look at a rare phenomenon at Yosemite National Park. The so-called firefall only happens once a year for about 10 minutes. When the sun is setting, the setting sun hits the Horsetail waterfall just right. I'll see you again tomorrow. Good night, and God bless.